The day had started like any other for Rex. He drove his small repair vehicle across the wasteland alone, tools rattling in the back, dust rising behind the wheels. The sky above was a dull gray, the kind that made everything look flat and lifeless. There were no trees out here. No water. Just rocks and cracked ground stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. Rex was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was just an engineer sent out to fix a broken relay station 3 kilometers east of the last outpost. It was a simple job. Go out, fix the signal tower, come back before dark. He had done it a dozen times before. He was humming quietly to himself when he saw the smoke. It was thin at first, just a dark line rising against the gray sky. He slowed the vehicle and squinted. Then he saw the second line of smoke. Then the third. Something had come down hard out here, and whatever it was big. Rex stopped the vehicle and stepped out. The wind hit him immediately, cold and dry, carrying the smell of burning metal. He pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the smoke. What he found stopped him cold. A ship had crashed into the rocky ground at a steep angle. It was not a human ship. The design was too organic, too curved, built from dark materials that looked more grown than made. One side had been completely torn open on impact. Pieces of the hull were scattered across the ground for 100 meters in every direction. Some were still smoking. Some were glowing faintly at the edges, cooling down slowly in the cold air. Rex stood there for a moment just taking it in. Then he moved forward carefully, stepping over broken pieces of hull, watching where he put his feet. He was not sure what he was looking for. Survivors, maybe. Someone to help. Some sign of life in all that wreckage. He found none at first. The interior of the ship was dark and broken. Walls had collapsed inward. The floor was tilted at a sharp angle, making every step difficult. Rex used the small light clipped to his jacket to look around. He saw shapes in the dark, still and silent, and he understood quickly that there was nothing he could do for them. He was about to turn back when he heard it. It was a sound so small he almost missed it. A breath. A tiny, wet, struggling breath coming from somewhere beneath a section of collapsed wall ahead of him. Rex froze. He listened. There it was again. He moved fast, climbing over broken pieces of ship, dropping to his knees in front of the collapsed section. He pressed his light close to the gap and looked through. In the small dark space beneath the fallen wall, curled tight and still, was a dragon child. It was small. Much smaller than he expected. Its scales were a deep blue-gray, dusty now with debris. Its wings were folded against its body, but even from here Rex could see that something was wrong with them. They were bent at angles that wings should not bend. One was torn at the edge, dried blood dark against the scales. The child's chest moved. Barely. Just enough to tell him it was still alive. Rex did not think. He just started moving. He grabbed the edge of the fallen wall section and pulled. It did not move. He shifted his position, planted his feet, and pulled again with everything he had. This time it shifted, scraping loudly across the floor. He pulled again. And again. His shoulder was already sore from the drive out, a dull ache he had been ignoring all morning. Now, as he hauled against the heavy metal, something sharp moved inside his shoulder and he felt a hot burst of pain that made him gasp. He looked down. A piece of debris had sliced through his jacket at the shoulder. The fabric around it was wet and dark. He had cut himself without noticing, probably when he first climbed into the wreck. He pressed his free hand against it for a moment, breathing through his teeth. It was bleeding. Not dangerously, not yet, but enough to be a problem if he ignored it for too long. He looked back at the dragon child. It was so small. His breath was so thin. Rex let go of his shoulder and grabbed the wall again. He pulled until the gap was wide enough. Then he crawled through carefully, reached in with both arms, and lifted the child as gently as he could manage. It was heavier than it looked, dense and solid the way all reptiles are, but still small enough for him to carry. It did not wake. It did not move. It just breathed, slow and shallow against his chest. Rex climbed back out of the wreck with the child held close, his shoulder burning, his jacket wet with blood. He stood in the cold air outside and looked around at the empty wasteland. No one was coming. There was no signal out here. His communicator showed one weak bar that flickered and died when he tried to use it. The nearest outpost was far. His vehicle was back across the field. The wind picked up, cold and sharp. Rex looked down at the dragon child in his arms. The tiny chest rose. Fall. Rose again. He started walking back toward his vehicle. He did not know if he could save this child. He did not know if he had the tools or the skill or the time. He only knew one thing for certain. He was not leaving it here. Rex laid the dragon child down on the flat cargo bed of his vehicle as carefully as he could. He worked fast. The temperature was already dropping and the sun was sitting low on the horizon, bleeding out what little warmth was left in the gray sky. He did not have much time before the cold became a serious problem. For him it was uncomfortable. For the child in this condition it could be fatal. He opened his emergency kit and laid everything out on the seat beside him. It was a standard field kit built for humans. Bandages, antiseptic, a small roll of medical tape, 2 pain tablets, a silver emergency blanket, a handheld heat patch meant to last 6 hours. Nothing in it had been designed with a dragon child in mind. But it was what he had, and Rex had spent 15 years as an engineer learning to work with what he had. He started with the wings. Up close, in the last light of the day, they looked worse than they had inside the wreck. The left wing was bent sharply near the middle joint, the kind of bend that meant the bone beneath had snapped clean. The right wing was torn along the outer edge, a ragged split in the thin membrane that had dried and crusted over during the time in the wreck. Rex was no doctor. He knew that. But he also knew that leaving a broken bone unsupported overnight would cause more damage, and the child could not afford more damage. He went back to the wreck. He moved quickly through the debris field, picking up pieces as he went. Flat strips of hull plating, thin but firm. A length of wire bundled near what looked like an electrical panel. A section of soft insulation material, pale and clean on the inside. He carried it all back to the vehicle and sorted through it under the small light clip to his jacket. He cut the insulation into strips with his utility knife. He shaped 2 pieces of hull plating into flat supports, bending the edges slightly so they would cup the wing without pressing too hard. Then he began working slowly, talking himself through each step out loud the way he always did when a job required more patience than tools. He wrapped the left wing gently. Support piece beneath, insulation padding around the joint, wire looped carefully to hold it all in place without cutting into the scales. He checked the tension twice. Not too tight. Tight enough. He moved to the right wing and cleaned the torn membrane edge with a small amount of antiseptic, then covered it with a strip of medical tape pressed down as smoothly as he could manage. The child did not wake through any of it. That worried him. He covered the child with the silver emergency blanket, tucking the edges under to hold the warmth in. Then he turned to the heat problem. The heat patch from his kit would not be enough. It was a small disc meant to warm a human hand or foot, not to keep a cold-blooded creature alive through a wasteland night. Rex stood beside the vehicle and thought for a moment, then walked back to the wreck one more time. He found what he needed near the rear of the ship. A power cell, cracked but not fully dead, still holding a low charge. A coil of conductive cable. 2 metal plates from an interior panel. He brought them back, sat on the ground beside his vehicle, and built a simple resistance heater. It was not elegant. It was a loop of cable connected to the cell, running current through the 2 plates positioned to radiate heat upward. He had built worse with less on remote job sites where equipment failed and deadlines did not. He tested it carefully with the back of his hand. Warm. Steady. Safe enough. He placed it beneath the cargo bed, close to where the child lay. Then he sat down against the side of the vehicle, his back to the metal, the cold ground under him, and he waited. His shoulder had stopped bleeding, but it was stiff now, the torn muscle tightening as the night cooled. He had cleaned it and wrapped it with the remaining bandages from the kit. It hurt steadily, a deep dull ache that sharpened every time he moved his arm. He took one of the 2 pain tablets and saved the other. The wasteland at night was completely silent. No wind. No sound from the wreck. Just the faint hum of his makeshift heater and the slow, thin breathing of the child on the cargo bed above him. Rex talked. He talked because the silence felt wrong. He talked about the repair job he had never finished, about the relay tower still sitting broken 3 kilometers east. He talked about the first engine he had ever rebuilt, 16 years old in his uncle's garage, grease on his hands and no idea what he was doing. He talked about small things, simple things, anything that kept his voice moving in the dark. At some point deep in the night, he stopped mid-sentence. The child's eyes were open. They were large eyes, much larger than he expected, a pale amber color that caught the faint light of the heater and glowed very softly. They were looking at him. Not with fear. Not with understanding. Just looking the way a creature looks when it is too weak to do anything but exist. Rex went very still. He looked back at those pale amber eyes and did not say a word for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You're still here. Good." The child blinked once, slow and heavy. Then the eyes closed again. Rex leaned his head back against the vehicle and let out a long breath into the cold dark air. The heater hummed. The child breathed. He pulled his jacket tighter and kept watch through the rest of the night. Rex did not sleep. He had tried, somewhere around the 3rd hour of the night, closing his eyes and letting his head rest against the cold metal of the vehicle. But every time he started to drift, his shoulder pulled him back with a sharp reminder, or the child's breathing would shift slightly and he would sit up fast, checking, counting breaths until he was sure. By the time the sky began to lighten in the east, pale and slow, he had given up on sleep entirely. He stood, stretched his stiff legs and checked on the child first. Still breathing. The silver blanket had held the warmth in well enough through the night. The wing splints had stayed in place. Rex checked the tension on the wire loops carefully, adjusted one that had loosened slightly, and tucked the blanket back around the small body. Then he tried his communicator again. Nothing. Not even the weak flickering bar from the night before. The crash site had knocked out whatever signal had been reaching this far out, or the communicator itself had taken more damage than he realized. He turned it off and put it back in his pocket to save the battery in case something changed later. He stood in the early gray light and thought clearly about his situation. His vehicle had broken down the day before he ever found the crash site. It was sitting 200 meters back, one rear axle snapped clean, going nowhere without parts he did not have. The relay station he had come to fix was in the wrong direction and unmanned anyway. The nearest outpost with people and medical equipment was roughly 2 days of travel east across open terrain. 2 days on foot. With a dragon child who could not walk. With one good arm. Rex looked at his vehicle for a long moment. Then he walked to it and started taking it apart. He removed the 2 largest flat panels from the cargo bed sides, each about 1.5 meters long and 0.5 meters wide. He found 4 lengths of strong cable in the equipment box and a roll of cargo strapping he used for securing equipment during transport. He laid the 2 panels flat on the ground side by side, overlapping slightly, and lashed them together with the cable, wrapping and knotting until the join was solid and did not flex. He tested it by standing on it. It held. He built up the edges on 2 sides using smaller pieces of scrap metal bent upward, so the child would not roll off on uneven ground. He patted the surface with the remaining insulation material from the wreck, layering it thick enough to cushion against the jolts of rough terrain. Then he cut the cargo strapping into lengths and rigged a harness across the sled, the kind that would hold the child securely without pressing on the damaged wings. He fashioned a pulling harness for himself from the remaining cable, looping it across his chest and under his good arm, keeping the weight off his damaged shoulder as much as possible. He tested the pull on flat ground first, dragging the empty sled in a short circle. Moved. It was heavy. But it moved. He went back to the vehicle, lifted the child carefully and carried it to the sled. He laid it down on the insulation padding and secured the harness straps one by one, checking each one twice. The child stirred faintly during the transfer, a small sound escaping, something between a breath and a tone that Rex had no word for. Then it settled again. Rex placed the heat patch from his kit under the edge of the blanket, activated it and pressed it flat. 6 hours of warmth. He would need to think about heat again after that. He picked up the pull line, settled the harness across his chest and started walking east. The first kilometer was the hardest simply because he did not yet know how hard all the others were going to be. The ground was uneven, cracked rock and loose stone that shifted under his boots and caught the edge of the sled every few meters. Each time the sled snagged he had to stop, shift his weight, pull at a different angle to free it, then start again. His shoulder ached constantly, a steady deep burn that lived just below the level he could ignore. He counted steps for a while. Then he stopped counting steps and just walked. The sun climbed slowly. The wasteland offered no shade and no softness, just rock and dust and the occasional ridge of broken ground that forced him to find a way around rather than through. He stopped twice in the first hour to check on the child, kneeling beside the sled and watching the small chest rise and fall, adjusting the blanket where the wind had caught an edge. The child's color concerned him. The deep blue-gray of the scales had taken on a dull, flat quality that had not been there the night before. Rex was not a doctor and he had no way to measure what that meant, but he knew what things looked like when they were fading, and he did not like what he saw. He stood up and pulled harder. The second kilometer went faster than the first because he stopped thinking about his shoulder and started thinking about the terrain ahead, reading the ground the way he read a broken machine, looking for the path of least resistance, planning 3 steps ahead instead of 1. By the 3rd kilometer his boots had rubbed a raw patch on his left heel and the pull harness had worked a bruise into his chest through his jacket. He stopped, drank half his water and looked back at how far he had come. Then he looked forward at how far he had to go. He turned forward, adjusted the harness, and kept walking. 1 more kilometer, he told himself. Then 1 more after that. The storm came without much warning. Rex had seen the sky changing for about an hour before it hit. The color shifted from pale gray to a deeper, heavier shade, the kind of gray that had weight behind it. The wind picked up slowly at first, just enough to push dust across the ground in thin streams. Then faster. Then faster still, until the dust was not streams anymore but walls, rolling across the wasteland in long brown curtains. Rex pulled harder. He had covered more ground than he expected through the morning. His legs had found a rhythm somewhere around the 4th kilometer, a steady mechanical pace that his body had settled into without being asked. His shoulder had gone from sharp pain to a deep numb throb that he had simply filed away and stopped paying attention to. The sled dragged behind him, catching on rocks, pulling back against every step, but moving. Always moving. He had just stopped to check on the child when the first real gust hit. It came from the northwest, hard and cold, and it nearly knocked him off his feet. The silver blanket tore loose at one corner and snapped loudly in the wind before Rex grabbed it and pressed it back down with both hands. He tucked it tight under the harness straps and held it there for a moment while the gust rolled over him, eyes squeezed shut against the flying grit. When he opened his eyes, the sky to the northwest was a dark brown wall moving fast. Rex looked at the sled. He looked at the terrain ahead. There was no shelter. No ridge deep enough, no rock large enough to stop what was coming. Out here there was nothing between him and the storm except open ground. He picked up the pole line and walked into it anyway. The storm hit fully about 10 minutes later. The wind came in hard sustained bursts that pushed against him like a physical weight. The dust was everywhere, in his eyes, in his teeth, coating the inside of his nose and throat with every breath. He pulled his collar up over his mouth and squinted forward, picking out the direction from the faint glow of his compass needle, one hand always on the pole line. The sled was harder to manage now. The wind caught it from the side and pushed it offline constantly, and every correction cost him something. His shoulder, which had gone mercifully numb for a while, woke back up with the extra effort and began sending sharp specific pain up into his neck and down into his fingers. The infected skin around the wound was hot and swollen. He could feel it clearly now, tight against the bandage, pulsing with his heartbeat. He had been walking for most of the day. He had eaten one ration pack at midday and saved the second for later. His water was 3/4 gone. His heat patch had run out 2 hours ago and he had nothing to replace it with, only the blanket and his own body heat when he stopped to check on the child. He kept walking. An hour into the storm his legs stopped working properly. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of collapse, no sudden failure. His legs simply became very heavy, each step requiring a conscious decision in a way that walking normally did not. He was aware that this was a bad sign. He was aware that his body was running low on things it needed. He noted it the way he noted a warning light on a machine, acknowledged it and kept moving. He made it another 200 meters. Then his left knee buckled on a loose stone, and he went down hard on his side, the pole line still in his hand, the sled jerking to a stop beside him. Rex lay on the cold ground for a moment and looked up at the brown churning sky. Everything hurt. His shoulder. His heel. His chest where the harness had been grinding all day. His throat was raw from dust. His eyes burned. He was cold in a deep way, the kind of cold that had worked its way inside and settled there. He told himself to get up. His body did not respond. He lay there for what felt like a long time, breathing dust-thick air, listening to the wind tear across the wasteland around him. He thought about the outpost. He thought about how far he had already come and how far was still left. He did calculations in his head that he did not like the results of. Then he felt it. Something small and light touched the back of his hand. He turned his head slowly and looked. The dragon child's small claw had slipped out from under the edge of the blanket. The tiny scaled fingers were resting against the back of Rex's hand, loose and still. It was not intentional. The child was not awake. It was simply the way the arm had fallen when the sled jerked to a stop, nothing more than gravity and reflex. Rex looked at that small claw for a long moment. He thought about the pale amber eyes that had opened in the dark and looked at him without fear. He sat up. It took him 3 tries to get fully upright. He used the pole line to help, hauling himself hand over hand until he was standing. His legs shook for a moment, then steadied. He unzipped his jacket, took it off and laid it over the child, pressing it down firmly under the harness straps on top of the silver blanket. The cold hit his arms immediately, sharp and serious. He picked up the pole line, settled it across his chest, turned his face into the wind and the dust and the driving cold. And he walked. Rex did not remember the last 2 kilometers. He remembered the storm thinning slightly, the wind dropping from a roar to a push. He remembered seeing lights ahead, faint and orange through the dust, and not being entirely sure if they were real. He remembered deciding they were real because he needed them to be, and walking toward them anyway. He remembered the pole line in his hands. After that, There was nothing until the lights were very close and very bright, and there were voices, human voices, loud and sharp with alarm, and hands grabbing him from both sides. He heard himself say very clearly, "The child first." Then the ground came up and everything went quiet. He woke 3 days later. The room was small and white and warm. A proper warm, the kind that came from a working heating system and solid walls, not from a salvaged power cell and 2 metal plates. Rex lay still for a moment and simply felt it, the warmth and the stillness and the absence of wind. His shoulder had been properly treated while he was out. He could feel the difference immediately, clean bandaging, the wound closed and dressed correctly, the infected heat gone. His left heel was wrapped. There was a fluid line running into his right arm. Everything hurt in the manageable way that things hurt when they are healing rather than the sharp, urgent way they hurt when something is going wrong. He turned his head and found a nurse sitting at a small desk near the door. She noticed him move and looked up quickly. She crossed the room, checked his eyes, checked the fluid line, asked him 2 short questions about how he felt. He answered both. Then he asked about the child. She paused for just a moment. Then she said the child was alive. Rex closed his eyes and breathed out very slowly. She told him the medical team had worked through the first night. The wing fracture had been serious but clean. The splinting Rex had done in the field had held the bone in the right position through the journey, which had made the difference between a clean repair and something much worse. The child had been severely cold and severely depleted but had stabilized by the 2nd day. It was eating now, small amounts, carefully managed. It was going to be all right. Rex did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He slept again after that, a long deep sleep with no dreams, and when he woke the 2nd time the room was different. He knew it before he opened his eyes. There was a presence in the room that had not been there before, a weight to the air, a stillness that was not the stillness of an empty space but the stillness of something very large holding itself very carefully quiet. Rex opened his eyes. The elder dragon filled nearly a third of the room. She was enormous, scaled in deep charcoal and silver, old in the way that mountains are old, with a density and a gravity that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with time. Her head was lowered. Not because the ceiling forced it, though the ceiling was close. She had lowered it deliberately, the great scaled jaw angled down toward the floor, the massive neck curved in a bow that Rex understood without needing anyone to explain it. He had seen engineers bow their heads over machines they could not fix. He had seen people bow their heads over graves. He recognized the shape of it, the weight that a body carries when it is trying to express something that words cannot hold. Rex looked at her for a long moment. She did not speak. She simply held the bow, still and steady, her amber eyes, the same amber as the child's, fixed on him from beneath the lowered head. Rex felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for. He thought about the wasteland. He thought about the night against the cold metal of the vehicle, talking to himself in the dark. He thought about the pole line in his hands and the storm in his face and the small claw resting against the back of his hand on the cold ground. He thought about the fact that he was an engineer. Not a soldier. Not a medic. Not anyone trained for any of what had happened out there. Just a man with tools and a working knowledge of how to hold broken things together until proper help arrived. He looked at the elder dragon and he gave a small nod in return, the best bow he could manage from a flat hospital bed with a fluid line in his arm. He hoped she understood it. He thought she did. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 beings who had nothing to prove to each other and nothing left to explain. Then Rex turned his head toward the door where the nurse had just appeared with a tray. He asked, in the same straightforward tone he used when checking whether a repaired machine was running correctly, whether the little one had started eating yet. The nurse smiled and said yes. Small amounts. Getting stronger every day. Apparently the child had been trying to sit up that morning, which had required 2 staff members and a considerable amount of patience to manage. Rex smiled at the ceiling. It was a small smile, the kind that did not need an audience. The kind that comes from somewhere quiet and stays there. The elder dragon lifted her head slowly. She watched the human in the bed with his broken shoulder and his wrapped heel and his fluid line, smiling at the ceiling of a small white room in the middle of nowhere. And she understood something that her kind had not understood before. That some creatures did not need great power to do great things. They just needed to refuse to walk away.